Okay. Well, thank you all very much indeed for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Subramanian. He's a professor of population health and geography at Harvard, and he did his undergraduate degree in Delhi and his PhD at the renowned University of Portsmouth in the UK. And his research encompasses a very wide variety of things which are of interest to us at our school: social and contextual determinants of health, neighborhoods and health, causes and consequences of undernutrition, and multi-level modeling. But today he's going to talk to us about the average treatment effect. So,
thank you. I think I have this. Yeah. How do I turn this? I think I already have this one. Thank you, Mary, for inviting me for this grand rounds. The first time I heard the word grand rounds, initially I thought it's going to be a medical school. Doesn't the terminology come from there? I was just talking to Paolo. But thank you again for having me here. What I thought was I'll just share something that I've been sort of thinking over the last couple of years. And the context of medical school was like, what I'm going to say is probably they might connect more to some extent in one sense because of the concept of heterogeneity, which is very obvious when you see patients. They come in all different. But in population health, I'm hoping this will provoke some interesting discussion and conversation. So this is the main thrust of my talk is going to be, in the field of epidemiology, very broadly defined, or population health. I feel that there is a sort of a sense that individual variation, so the fact that health and diseases vary between individuals, is often treated as a nuisance, and I'll make that case both from a methodologic standpoint, as well as I think there have been folks such as Jeffrey Rose who would say that it's largely stochastic, if not a nuisance. So hence we should not too much focus on that. And the second, I feel the more I sort of scan the literature, including many of the stuff that me and a lot of my colleagues have written, there seems to be this sort of conflation between these two concepts of inferences, targets of inference, between populations and within population. Although, again, as you would well appreciate, Jeffrey Rose made that question very clear, but the practice of it has been very unclear, I would argue. So those are my sort of two big claims that I'm going to sort of make in today's talk. Let me start at taking us a step behind, beginning to poke some holes at this notion of average treatment effect, or generally the average. So there's this book by Todd Rose. He's an educator or a researcher in the field of education who a couple of years ago wrote this book called The End of Average, largely in the context of how children learn. But there I saw this example that he talks about. So this is about World War II. Turns out that a lot of planes were crashing. U.S. was experiencing a huge fatality, both in material terms, so planes were crashing, and human terms, the pilots were also dying. And after much scrutiny, it pretty much turned out that it was not a mechanical error or a human error. So the training was fine, and so was the equipment that they were flying did not the cause. And they finally turned, after much scrutiny, okay, what could be potentially wrong with the sort of the design of the cockpit. So if you think about the fighter plane from then or even now, it only has a couple of seats, or one. And these are some dimensions that you could get a sense within a cockpit, which looks like this. So it turns out that the design of the cockpit was not just randomly done by the engineers. It was based on the measurements of a survey of 4,000 pilots from 1926, so 25 years ago. And based on those sort of average measurements on like 10 different dimensions, aspects, this was designed in terms of the height of the, whatever the space from the windshield to the seat, et cetera, et cetera. And when this was happening, they commissioned Gilbert Daniels to kind of look into what was going on when these crashes were happening. So he was the one who sort of unearthed this aspect. And he wrote this monograph as to sort of the United States Air Force called The Average Man. And so this is what he went ahead and did. So that's the original sample of 4,000 pilots. And they were measured on all of those dimensions, stature, chest circumference, sleeve length, et cetera, et cetera. The mean is, you can compute the mean, the standard deviation, and then he defined the range that he considered average, which was the middle 30% of the value. So pretty generous definition. It didn't have to be precisely that value of average, but somewhere in that range of mid 30%. And, that many sort of, you could say the range, N within that range was something like this. About 1,000 pilots fell, N for that range would be that. So, as you know, pilots, would you consider pilots a very homogeneous group? Certainly more homogeneous than what we are here, right? A random population. So how many individual pilots, this was the question that Gilbert Daniels asked in his report, how many of each of the 4,000 individual pilots actually fit the average pilot on all 10 measurements? Excellent. 0. Yeah. And that's a homogeneous group. Okay, so that's, if you can't find average to apply to a group like pilots, like I would automatically be disqualified to be a pilot based on height, right? You already have to be of a certain height, whatever shape, size to get in on physical dimension. So he concluded if you design the cockpit to fit the average, you're pretty much guaranteed that it will not fit anybody. And of course, here it was very consequential, both for the lives of the pilot as well as from a material perspective. Another example, probably closer to our health field, So there was this there's a classic book. It's a really interesting book if you want to read. It's called Perfectly Average by Anna Kradick, who talks about just the concept of average. So there was a time when average was quite a desirable. You aspire to be the ideal was associated with the notions of average. Not now, but there was a time. So she talks through about different ways in which we have thought about this term, this thing, the average. And in that book, in her book, she just talks about this kind of a weird adventure that these two gentlemen went into. So one is Dr. Dickinson, who's an OBGYN, and a sculptor, Mr. Abram Belsky. And they went around and sort of measured, 15,000 young adult women on a number of body dimensions to come up with this one. So based on those measurements, and because one of us is a sculptor, they sculpted what they called as norma, the normal. Average is also often people call as typical or normal. Again, the book goes into very sort of interesting layers of how we talk about it. But that's what a sort of, if you sculpt out based on the average, this is what you get. And apparently at those times, there's again 45 statues of Norma. By the way, there was also a Norman. They did one for after that. Were being sold at the Cleveland, museum. And this is the sort of the code that comes in that statement there. Years of research preceded the sculpting, and these two are recognized as the world's two outstanding geniuses in reproducing scientifically accurate detail of a human body. Right? Interesting exercise. So, and the craziness did not just stop there. They then had a contest. So they said, well, this is Are You Norma? Typical Women Search to Reward Ohio Winners. And so anybody from the population could sort of enter the contest, fill whatever their measures are on each of these dimensions, and send it in. So you know where this is going, right? So there were about 4,000 women who did enter. How many resemble Norma on all the 9 dimensions? 0, yeah. So, by the way, they did end up giving somebody a prize, even though it was not perfectly matched, and that was this lady. So she got $100. So that's the closest you could get on, I think, like 4 dimensions, like 30 women matched or something like that. Anyway, you get the point. So that's sort of these examples. Basically, I just want to underscore that there's lots of variability between individuals, especially when it comes to health and disease, right? And I think in most cases within population health, we could pretty much substitute, whenever people say population, it's pretty much average. So I think they are just interchangeably, from a kind of a foundational standpoint, it's a mean-centric approach to understanding variation in health. And there are 2 targets of scientific inference that we could say, as I said before. One is we want to say something about why does the mean vary across 2 populations. So that's a sort of a between population question. And we typically go about by constructing average values for some grouping, pick your favorite, and then we compare that group and group differences on the mean. And if they differ, we say there is a substantial difference between populations. And then there is the other dimension, which is the between individual within a population, which is differences in health between individuals but within a population. And most, if not all, research, I would claim, is about between populations. So even when you have individual data, we are always just reporting on average description or explanation. Right? I think this notion of there is ecologic data, there is individual data, that's a sort of a second order issue. Regardless of what data you have, we mainly focus on averages and not on the variability. But at the same time, the reality is that populations don't die or become sick, or groups. It's the individuals who die and become sick. And so, I would argue that from a mechanistic perspective, if population health has to have a stronger basis, then you cannot ignore how it actually impacts individuals, both between or within populations. And turns out, why do we focus on averages? Because that's all we can. So if you do on methodology in social science or even epi, this is described as the fundamental problem of causal inference, which is that you can never observe the counterfactual for an individual. But under some conditions, so you can never estimate individual causal effect because the individual cannot be in 2 states simultaneously, right? In the treatment state and the control state. But methodologically, under some conditions, i.e. a perfect RCT, what we can observe are the average treatment effects, where 2 different set of individuals, one group gets treatment and a different group gets, and under conditions where that's purely random, so thanks to Fisher, we know that we can estimate the average treatment effect if the trial is of a high quality. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Maybe we are interested in this individual causal effect, right, at the end of the day. But all we can methodologically or scientifically estimate is this, because that we already know. There's no way to estimate individual causal effect. But that cannot be the reason to say that, well, that's why we should focus on the average. Well, that's one thing that's all we can, but we don't know whether that is the quantity that we want to ultimately be interested in. And in population health, we went a little further, so at least in like econ and other social sciences, they would say, well, it's because of this we don't bother estimating individual causal effect, because we cannot. But I felt in social epi and population health, we went a little bit further to actually say that, actually individual causal effect is not that interesting. And I think there is a problem there, I feel. So I would say like the person who most crystallized this idea of between population and within population, or between population and between individual as a target of inference was Jeffrey Rose. Of course, a rich body of work. But the one that I want to focus on that I've just highlighted is this, where he very clearly articulated the two targets of interest, sick individuals and sick populations. And he made a very strong distinction that they are quite distinct. And I would argue they are actually more related than distinct, at least from an epidemiologic standpoint. And this is how Rose defined what he literally called the population health approach. So the study of individual susceptibility is important, but the fundamental questions are what determines the population's mean blood pressure. These were the examples that he had, so on, cholesterol, body weight, alcohol, and how might that mean be changed. And I think he, from the lit review that we did, as a conceptual paper, no one else I've seen has articulated a stronger case for a focus on average than Jeffrey Rose, in a very explicit way. Others are more sort of conflating different things, but Rose was very clear that we only care about explaining mean differences or differences in the mean between two populations. And although I should point out here, and I'll come back, he talks about population health, and the word population is used quite a lot in his writings, but he never quite defines population. It's a completely arbitrary concept, and it's completely modifiable in one sense, in terms of what would you consider to be a population. And if you change the definition of the population, the mean changes, everything changes. So it's a kind of the modifiability problem is not quite tackled, which is problematic of any statistic that you provide at the aggregate level. And this idea that variation equals error or random, well, that pretty much comes from Quetelet, who was studying stars almost 200 years ago, and he very rightly identified that if you ask any given individual to locate a particular location of a star, each of the measurements would become with some measurement error, my height, what my sight is, etc., etc. But the average of that would be a much stronger predictor of the true location of the star. So hence he sort of focused that anything that the average was seen as a very, has less measurement error. Right? So if you view individual differences as measurement error, that's good. That's fine. Then average is good. But if individuals differ, and that variation is simply variation and not error, then it opens up a whole other level of scrutiny, as opposed to the origins of where average came from, which was in this context. And to sort of set things of this between and within population, I'm using one of Jeffrey Rose's example where he showed the population distribution or distribution of blood pressure in two populations, the Kenyan nomads to the left and the London civil servants to the right. And without going into the different aspects of this, the target of inference in most research happens to be the mean value and how different are they, which is that. This is all we pretty much do in most research. You can say treatment control, black, white, male, female, and that's what we end up explaining, so to speak, that mean difference. And this is another just example which he talks about in his lecture. So if you take this case here, there's a cholesterol distribution in two populations, the 7-country study, South Japan and Finland. And in Rose's terms, probably Finland would be regarded as a, quote, a sick population. Why? Because it's shifted to the right. The cholesterol levels on average are higher in Finland compared to Japan. And this is sort of really the focus of what I would say most of the social inequalities in health. You could treat these two in any form you want, but you can change it just, any categories. And in general, we try to explain the differences between those categories on their mean value. And if you think about a typology where you also want to, but if you think about this graph, right? So the mean differ between the two distributions. Yeah. So yes, while Finland on average has a higher level of cholesterol in its population, it's also much more variable. Right? So the mean will have less meaning in this population. To say that on average Finland is very high is kind of dragging these guys, saying, no, it's not very high. It's just more variable. It's high and more variable. On the other hand, Japan is low and less variable. So where the mean, if you say the mean for Japan is X, it has more meaning in that population, but the mean for Finland has less meaning. But if you think about the typologies that we sort of typically talk about in social inequalities in health, you can think about it's always on the lines of averages. So in this particular example, Finland has a higher mean value on a risk factor that's not good if it's high, and Japan has a lower one. And then there's sort of the rhetoric of sick population or which population is doing worse. We would probably declare Finland as a sick population, but that is under the assumption that the variance is the same in both the populations. Right? But I tried to look into that, in most of Rose's writing. I don't know how he could not comment on this big difference that you see here. It's hard to not notice for Finland, or for Japan, the fact that it's so tight. Right? So if it's just natural, it should be the same in both. If it's random and natural, it should be more or less the same in both populations. But it was not. And if you incorporate this information, so I would argue that when you compare the mean differences, that's social inequalities in health, this being the two social groups, while if you look at within, that's really just health inequalities. And for a full description of what's happening in the population, you need two parameters, not just one, to describe what's going on. So Finland is not just high, but also more variable, so high variance. And Japan is not just low, but also small. Right? So if you assume that they are the same, you probably are not going to make the right kind of inference for Finland for sure. You will be overestimating exaggerating the fact that Finland is a sick population in the case of Finland. Because it's also highly variable, that would be dubious. And you will be understating how the mean in Japan is low, because it's not only low, it's also less variable. So there is a sort of an interpretative difference. And in ecology, there is a very rich literature around using the variance parameter in a population from a substantive perspective, not just mean. So very briefly, sort of Schmalhausen and many others, Lowenstein and Dick Levins, and Sandro Galea has some papers that he did. And the basic idea here is that if you want to think about a disadvantaged population, from a Rose perspective, all it needs to have is a higher mean on some bad outcome, right? High mortality, et cetera, et cetera. Schmalhausen would also argue that a disadvantaged population, whichever way we define, will also have a high variance. So if it's a sort of if it's a generally disadvantaged group, a very small perturbation would lead to a very high variance, because some people will be very resilient to it, and in a disadvantaged group, not just the mean. So it's not like there is no conceptual framework to incorporate both. It's just that I would argue we haven't paid enough attention to the other dimension, which might be very important, especially for health and disease, since they already vary so much to start with. So I think whether you look at within a population changing over time, i.e. the same population changing over time, or between populations at any given time, this is how I would sort of more or less characterize, which is this assumption that they change on the mean, things may differ on the mean, but they're always the same on the variance. Okay? And we've done a bunch of papers, I won't go into the detail, but when we look at BMI, changes in BMI over time for the same population, you don't get that picture. What you get is this picture. So yes, mean BMI has changed over years, okay, in any country or population. And that's like every year now Lancet produces something to show that, right? But what they don't show is that the increase is mainly happening, it's also getting more skewed to the right. There's hardly anything happening here, but there's a far more skew. So it's not like what Rose predicted, that populations move as a cohesive whole, not happening at least in BMI. You don't see any evidence of that. In the previous slide, we have looked at right from low middle income countries to very rich countries and heavy countries like ours. They're all still showing a right hand. And probably we are able to see this because for BMI, there is yet no known way to stop somebody. There's no effective medication so far, or no effective treatment that will hold the right-hand tail. For cholesterol, for blood pressure, we can hold somebody at this end. So we don't see the skew. The distribution is all a little messed up when we think about other risk factors where we have effective medication on the risk factor to control a particular risk factor. But for BMI, it still seems to be moving in its natural state. If you just there's no intervention, this is happening over time. And we see this also at any given time between groups. I just want to sort of highlight one thing here. So those are age groups, and that's the between individual variation in BMI, not the mean, but the variation. And these different things are the 5 quintiles of wealth. This is coming from a large low middle income country data set. So if you belong to sort of Q5, you are from the richest 20% of the population, and if you're Q1, you're from the poorest 20% of the population. We know that in these countries the mean may vary, but look how the variance is also different. So in these low middle income countries, richer women not only have a high BMI, but also high variation. So mean will have less meaning in the high income groups or wealth groups. While for the poor, low mean BMI and low variance, so tight variance. So the point I want to emphasize is whether, at least for BMI, when you look at the same population moving over time, we see a dispersion to the right. When we look at any given population and between groups at any given time, we still see a big difference. The point being, the assumption that variance remains constant is just not being shown in the data, at least the ones that we have looked so far. But in population health and in social epi, they go a little bit more further, I feel, where they say that just explaining this difference, they would say this pointless to look into that. Explaining this difference is enough. And there is a sort of strong tradition to that. and that this differences, is not very interesting and actually, not very worthwhile as a pursuit. And this mainly comes from the smoking debate around Vidal and then Richard Peto and then Jeffrey Rose and of course now George Davey Smith in some of his recent writings have reiterated this fact that looking at individual variability is a waste of time. Explaining individual variability is a waste of time. And Rose, this is the best graph that I find in Rose. He clearly had a foresight. He had thought through a lot of these questions. And this is why. So this is the risk factor, cholesterol, in two distributions. A distribution that has a coronary heart disease and a distribution of individuals that does not have coronary heart disease, right? And we all know cholesterol is seen as a risk factor for coronary heart disease. So if you look at these two distributions, you could be a very low cholesterol, right? But look at that, that's still, you could be just fine or not at all fine, or you could be very high cholesterol and you could still be just fine. And this is the sort of the challenge of making individual predictions. Rose clearly saw that right there. And then, and perhaps that's the reason why I said, but we can explain the mean differences so much more. Whether or not that's the difference that we care about, that's a second point. But this is very clear that our ability to explain variation between individuals within a population is very weak. And this insight, we went and tested. It's really all credits to Jeffrey Rose for having that insight and articulating it. It's so true, and I wonder if that's why in EPI we never report R square, because it's pretty bad. So this is again looking at BMI, and if I just take BMI of women across 57 countries, this is a very large sample of 500,000 women. So that's the sort of the variance when I adjust for age. It's 16, and I put like a bunch of variables in the model that typically SES type that in social EPI we would put. And all put together, the variance goes from 16.68 to 16.41, an explanation of about 1% or 2%, right, between individuals. Right? And now think about between population. So what would I have to do? I can, let's say, one operationalization of population is small areas. One definition. I could keep changing that definition, and the basic inference doesn't change. Villages in this context, or we took communities. So I can compute the mean BMI for every community, right? So instead of 500,000 women, I would have 30,000 communities, and I would have a mean BMI for every community, right? So if I have to explain that, so that's the variance. If I take country as a population or village as a population, that's the variance. And if I use the same set of variables to explain that variation, I get a much bigger number, right? So 40% is just explained by the mean values of education. If the village is rich, village is highly educated, it's an urban area, et cetera, compared to 2%, that's a heck of a lot more. And this is exactly what Rose, without running any of this, he said, we can explain a lot more at the population level, but not very much at the individual level. I'll return to that. I think it's a very important point for many. So yes, there's a lot more explanation, quote, at the population level, but remember that of all the variation, almost 80% is at the individual level. So there are two dimensions to it. Of the total variation in BMI, most of the variation is at the individual level. And we do a terrible job of explaining that. Much less is at the population level, and we do a pretty decent job of explaining that. But at the population level, we don't know what that actually means. What is it to be a mean BMI? places are not getting thinner. Some individuals would have to change. So it's more complex than what I realized. And in the context of the U.S., we are writing this paper. Roughly all SES put together in NHANES, the contribution of SES, if you just put every damn thing that's measured in NHANES, that you can SES, amounts to about 5% R square. So if I take all the BMI data from NHANES on adult men and women and say to what extent things like education, income, et cetera, explains that variability, it's about 5%. So if the last time I looked at, they keep updating that paper. Mary may know more about this. The Nature and the Science keeps updating how much can genetics explain in terms of the R square, right? So the latest one that I've seen is, I don't fully understand the methodology, but it's somewhere between 5% to 15 to 20%. Between individual variation using the polygenic scores and so on for BMI. So it's a kind of an interesting contrast. We are trying to do this exercise in the one data set where we have both, like AdHealth or HRS, where we can construct a score, a genetic score for the risk of BMI, high BMI, and we have a rich data on socioeconomic variables and so on. But not very, so this is take-home message. So lots of variation at individual level, terrible at explaining, much less at the population level, and pretty good at explaining. So what's the insight? So, and if George had a very nice paper called The Gloomy Prospect. That's the gloomy prospect, right? So it's not very encouraging to say only 2% of the variation is actually explained. And, as you can guess from that, so that's a picture of Winnie celebrating her 100th birthday by having a smoke. She smoked for 60 years of her life. It's one of my favorite papers to be written in more recent times around just. And more recently, I think there was a whole debate in cancer from a Nature paper that triggered this paper. But basically, the view that I feel where the field is in population health social epi is very well summarized in these two comments, where it currently is, which is this fact that I think we should ignore individual variability in health because it's mostly unpredictable or stochastic. They don't say it's error, but it's largely unpredictable, And at the individual level, George would argue it is chance. It's bad luck, and that's what Dahl said too. That's what Pito said too, at least for cancer. But at the population level, we can still do a lot. Okay, that's fine for smoking. I think there is some evidence that we can ignore the individual, and yet at the population level, we could do. But I think there's a problem with this kind of approach. It would be my claim. And there are 4 problems to that. This is the promise, is the last part of my talk. One, again, I've really tried to search for a field that claims to keep uttering the word population so many times. There is no way they differ in the population. It's just taken, if it's country, they call it populations. If it's age groups, it's called populations. Male, female, whatever, race, ethnic categories, population. I encourage you to read this article. For the first time, I thought, at least in the first half of this paper, my colleague Nancy Krieger really articulated that point. So how do we define? So this is exactly, if you're familiar with the spatial autocorrelation field, everybody talks about the MOP problem, modifiable areal unit problem. This is like what we call the MPUP problem, which is the modifiable population unit problem, because population is completely modifiable as a construct. And I think I find much more sympathizers to this idea and beginning to understand more the intersectionality group that has been talking about this for a while. right? So it's not about being women or being black, and there is a main effect or a multiplicator. They would say, oh, there's something unique about being black and women and some age, right? So, if populations are representations of some identity at a higher level, then often those identities will sit at the intersection by definition. And I think it's a really important point, I feel, to engage in that, because our inferences will change the moment we change our population. And I think like other fields do, like RCT, they spend a lot of time thinking about population, and yet they have the, quote, external validity problem. Right? Because internally, they think a lot about who should enter their study. In population health, I don't think we do that. So that, I think, is the first problem. How do we define and who defines? And the second point, which I want to emphasize, and this is something that Chris Murray and Emanuela Gacadou and Julio wrote about a couple of decades ago. So as per Rose, like, if the between individual variation is unchanging and constant because it was never tested, we just assumed it will always be the case. In a regression jargon, the assumption of homoscedasticity, we said, oh, that's just there. We know that, but nobody had tested whether that's true, or do populations have the same variance. And in the scenario where it's purely stochastic and natural, it should be more or less the same in any population, whichever way you slice it. But time we test that, it's not, in which case variation itself is patterned, i.e., then there must be something that's going on to explain that. And the third problem I find is what's referred to as this streetlight effect sign. So, including in some, simply because we can't, it's too hard or impossible to make predictions at the individual level, but we can do a really good job at the population level. That's pretty much like saying, I'll just do what's possible, not probably what's important. We have not quite discussed why that question from a target of inference is actually very important. And finally, I would say we have somehow assigned a normative significance to social inequalities in health. I don't know where exactly it comes from, but it seems to be that's very well founded, accepted, that there's a normative significance. When we say mortality in one group is higher than other, something is wrong, right? And I'm not saying that we should do that, but the same has not been advanced, and I can't see why that would not be the case at the same time. That we do that in healthcare access and so on, when you don't have access. But on outcomes, no, we don't do that. But if you think about sickness or health, it is not an abstract concept. It is very real. And the person who really sort of drove home this point, I don't know if you heard about the story of this great evolutionary biologist, Stephen Jay Gould. He wrote this piece, a very powerful piece, called The Median is in the Message. So Gould was diagnosed for a very fatal cancer, I think early 90s or late 80s. The prognosis was for about 6 months. And he went on to live about 20 years, and obviously didn't die of that particular thing. But the point he makes in this article is that we often go for all our research, scientific inferences, more or less, even when you have logistic or whatever you want to call it, it's fundamentally based on the shape. When you observe an individual, you feel the assumption is you being pulling from some larger distribution that looks like a bell shape. And that's a very foundational to most research that we do. But with illness and sickness, it rarely seems to be the case. For example, this would be the case. A lot of individuals with that kind of a diagnosis will die. very early on, within the 6 months. So the median doesn't make very sense. The median was 6 months, but very few will live on to live a very long life, sometimes even very healthy life, and so on. Or in this case, very few would die instantly and a lot would survive. So fundamentally, he was trying to drive home the point. So in what sense is the average, would you say, is important? Because the variability often trumps the central tendency. And this engagement, obviously, within the field, is coming much more in clinical medicine, and RCTs have been known to sort of now, they really sort of are trying to find a way to engage with this topic, because why can't we improve our predictions? So it's sort of really pretty pathetic. I was looking at this article, which was really, I had no idea, where the reading of the blood pressure that we take in a doctor's office, even when you do it 2 or 3 times, has no concordance or very little concordance when you do it ambulatory. So there were only 30% of the studies had a match between of all the studies that was mentioned in this story. So, and depending on that, you're basically kind of going to put an individual or a group on treatment. Right? And what was revealing about this article when I was reading was, she happens to be one of those, Gina Kolata, who writes, somebody who, depending on the day you're measuring her, has some blood pressure, but if you measured her over 10 days, she's all over the place. On average of that, she may come out higher, but super variable, versus somebody who might be coming consistently high with very little variability, whether you take ambulatory or in the clinician's office and so on. So there are really probably some latent class of individuals where you could say they're consistently high and not very variable, consistently low, not very variable, easy enough to deal with those 2 groups. Now, what do you do with the group that's very variable? Should you put them on the treatment or not, et cetera, et cetera? By the way, so she's not on the medication, even though she came out high. That was the whole point of her. It was quite revealing because we use this data all the time, papers after papers. So, but it turns out it's problematic. And this is a paper by Shore in Nature that came out. So he took the top 10 selling drugs, money-wise. Some of them reflective of, I guess, the burden too. And he showed, so for every, the red is, so let's say in the case of schizophrenia, the drug Abilify, if you give it to 5 people, only 1 will see a therapeutic benefit that is expected from that drug. 4 don't. Okay? And this is cholesterol. Okay? So for cholesterol, it's 1 to 19. And this is just to change the cholesterol level. Now, who cares about the cholesterol level itself, right? You don't care whether it's 200 or 120 or 180 or 160. You care because it happens to be a risk factor for heart attack. And when it comes to that, it's like you have to put 250 people on cholesterol to save 1 heart attack, and of course you don't know which one is going to be. So there's a real challenge both in terms of its final outcome, but even sort of just for the therapeutic benefits that it's supposed to deliver. That's a high prevalence thing in the population. It's Crestor, or you could take sort of for asthma, it's again 1 to 20. So people who do that. So it's a kind of, it's there all the time. And that's the reality it seems to be when it comes to sickness and disease. And these companies are not investing blindly millions and billions of dollars coming up with this, right? So they want this to go down. There is a sort of a monetary incentive. No wonder adherence is pretty low in all drugs, because the damn thing doesn't work for most people, right? So he wrote this thing where there is a sort of a revisiting this idea of N of 1 trial. We dismiss N of 1 saying, oh, that's mom's story, right? So anecdote. It's an N of 1. But there is a whole sort of methodology that they are working, trying to sort of come up with. And there is a genuine engagement happening in this clinical medicine, clinical epi as well. But I don't see that in population health, within the more standard population health. And, Juan Merlo, a colleague of mine, have been sort of, screaming for a while now that it's just not enough to know about the odds ratios, or relative risk, whatever way we want to call it, absolute or relative. But ultimately, what we want to know is, regardless of whether it's a medicine or poverty or whatever the social intervention might be, what is the ability of the exposure to discriminate who becomes a case and who does not? And that, I think you cannot shy away from if one is truly interested in improving health of populations. Either, we can live in the world of it's all chance random, which is where I think the world, or we really start engaging in more complex, difficult concepts of heterogeneity. Whether it's treatment heterogeneity, so the same treatment has different effects, or it is with different treatments, different types of, and we can discuss in the discussion more, I can elaborate that. Anyway, so final slide, take-home message. I think it's important to remember that it's individuals who get sick and die, usually not populations, unless it's an epidemic. Then, of course, we're all dead. And I think it's sort of this ecological fallacy can be actually more extended to something like a population fallacy, where we tend to apply average interpretation to all individuals and group, and I think that's problematic. And as I already alluded to, I think once you enter the population territory, or regardless, even when you're estimating variability, you have to define populations, and that itself is modifiable. So how do we sort of get a handle on that? Clearly, theory would help, or understanding more about that particular group's circumstances would help, but it's a point of engagement for research. And I think that inter-individual inequality or differences between individuals is not just error. And I think the more we engage, I think there's a stronger case than one could actually make for the issue of studying inequality in public health. I come from a social science background. If you're familiar with the field of economics, so that's like saying economists should just study per capita income or median income. Right? A lot of them do. They should never study Gini, income inequality, because that's exactly what health inequality would look like. Right? So they do both. But in public health, I think we just say per capita health, or some version of that, median health. But there is a sort of a health inequality that's also sort of, I think, important. All right. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. So that was fascinating. So much to think about. So does anyone have any questions on these things? Yeah, Andrew.
Thanks so much for the talk. It was really wonderful. So for the modifiable area unit problem, right? We have following Krieger. We can go up in ecological units and see stability. Can you think of an equivalent for the modifiable population unit problem that we could do with that same sort of kind of logic and ease?
So I think yes, it's sort of somewhere I feel that it sits between the two. We can combine the insights that we have learned from the MOP, which is now 35, 40 years old. And there we have brought both kind of a level of just sheer methodology, computing power to sort of see various just simple aggregations, some agnostic, some perhaps meaningful in some ways, and we can build that. The other part, I think we should certainly draw from that. I think the intersectionality theory group, I think here I don't feel that there is an easy way to have a more technocratic approach when it comes to population. Partly because it is, I think, much more ingrained in our, I don't know, the sense that, if you think about countries, nobody challenges the notion of country as one population, right? Under some scenario, it would come as one, not necessarily the scenario that you might be studying. So what we have tried to do is sort of the only agnostic approach that mirrors the population, the MOP thing has been, we have sort of published a couple of stuff where we have taken, like, let's say 8 variables, and let's say in each of the variables there are 2 or 3 categorical groups within that. So male, female, times 5 age group, times 3 race, ethnicity. So you could max it out, right? So if you have enough samples, such that you could say, okay, there are like 30,000 unique groupings that I can make given the data. So it's a function of what you observed. And then within each of those 30,000 groups, you would have few individuals who belong to that group if you have large enough data. And then to sort of see, in which groups is the variance the least, right? And if that's purely driven by noise, that is one way to think about it. Or if it's sort of something more systematic, then you might say, well, here's a group that has a very high mean value, and let's say high mean is a bad outcome, and low variance. So I would say, like, a combination of, okay, if that's the group you want to really target for public health intervention or understanding, then you set that group up, and then you have to create a contrast group. Whom are you going to compare them against, or study the variation within? But if the variation within is very small, then more or less it will be like the Japan situation. So anything that you study about cholesterol within Japan is, you're not going to get very much because it's very tight. So that's sort of something that we have played around with in the sort of the realm of what would be the equivalent, would be just treat everything as a categorical variable and max out the categories and make that as your quote population units. Because right now we treat them more as sort of separately, like it's either country or gender groups or age groups or race groups and so on. I don't know if that... okay.
I also thank you very much. I thought that was fascinating. But here's a particular problem that we face in environmental health. When you're trying to set a reference concentration of a chemical that's dangerous, typically you get a study that shows a no effect level or an effect level of the chemical, and then we have to extrapolate to the general population. And the typical default value for inter-individual variation is tenfold, so that would be tenfold below the population mean. Does that make sense?
Can you repeat the last part again? Yeah.
So we have an epidemiologic study, and one part per million is an effect level, and we want to set the tolerance at a no effect level, and the typical default is a tenfold factor below the effect level. Does that make, actually usually the no effect level? Does that make sense?
So in terms of the, when you say does that make sense, you mean the gap between what an individual might see as an effect versus what the average effect is?
Right.
I see. Hard for me to speculate, but that seems to be the order of magnitude when even just the examples that we've given, the huge variability that we see. My sense would be like in environmental epi, and I may be sort of circumventing your question here a little bit. I think if you get the mechanism right, then you can bring down that difference. If you're studying the group, So like for example, smoking and lung cancer, because the mechanisms are very clear, right? And in any population, if you expose that population to a carcinogen, you're more or less going to get a fourfold effect or something on average. Right? Now that doesn't mean that every smoker is going to get it, but that's a big effect, right? But partly because it's a big effect, because mechanistically we know it should affect from animal models and so on. So to sort of, I don't know how I would it be the case, because you see in a lot of RCTs as well, especially I read some commentaries on the drugs related to like dementia and Alzheimer's, where they said like, there's nearly not enough understanding of the mechanistic research that otherwise used to be before the drug is actually being put out. So if we don't understand why it works, having a very high sanctity RCT of what works is not terribly going to be very highly efficacious or effective. I think the one example that I read was exactly in the domain of statins. The generation of statins in the 1980s when they came out was terrible when Jeffrey Rose was writing this. And he was very cautious partly at that point. But there's a lot went into understanding of our mechanism of how we're going to block or whatever. I'm not an expert in that, but from what I consumed about that literature, it seemed from 80s to the generation of statins we see today, there's a lot of mechanisms that we understood better, and therefore we could deliver it better. So going back to the environmental thing, I don't know whether it's the tenfold is right or wrong, but I think in environmental sciences, my understanding is mostly there is always an animal model that precedes a lot of these much later. And if that's stronger, I would expect that gap to be smaller here. And if you can sort of show that, but that would be my sort of general thoughts on that, yeah. Sure.
Thank you. So I was the slide that resonated most with me was the one that showed when amine is increased, how the spread often also is increased, and I guess I'm thinking about interventions and how what that said to me was that it's hard for us to improve the mean of a population without creating further variability, or in other words, exacerbating health disparities. And I wondered if you've thought about it in that context. So it kind of follows that, as we try to move forward and improve the health of populations, that while we may improve outcomes for many, we invariably leave people behind, and the disparities get worsened. And does that suggest that there should be another approach to focusing on population health, which is, at the bottom of the distribution as opposed to the middle or at the top?
This is really interesting. I can't remember the author's name, but there was a very nice paper in BMJ that talked about when an intervention, and typically we find that, as you rightly pointed out, in most social population interventions, not only the mean social inequalities in health go up, but the health disparities also go up. So the treatment group looks more wider. And this seems to be a very general phenomena, actually. I was just looking at some paper on, we keep hearing about the effects of famine, hunger in utero. Then when you look at the outcomes, yes, on average, these kids who were exposed or have higher levels of cholesterol, BMI, much higher variability. There was just a paper that just I was browsing through. So going back to your point, I think it's sort of, when that happens, I think we have to go back to the drawing board a little bit. And I think there are multiple things that could be going on. One could be that, was this the right population to do this? Now, you could say you did it for entire New York before and after. Was that strategy. So this gets to your last point. Is there a sense of targeting that would be perhaps be more important instead of getting into other scientific debate? Oh, look, it's inequality increased, but you should have expected that, right? And whether it increased also, that's very important, right? If everybody responded in the way you expected it to respond, but some had a much bigger therapeutic benefit, then that's a different set of questions. So it could be the reach, it could be the last mile, adherence, whatever we want to call. But if fundamentally some group actually became worse off, and or nobody got worse off, some only improved. That, to me, I think, really going back to the drawing board of, is it really reflecting the underlying notion that it is truly one population? And if it is different populations, then how do we go about doing it? So that's number one. Number two, I would say methodologically, now there is more trials, at least in the econ literature. If you have come across this word, it's called quantile regression. So instead of just kind of modeling the mean differences in the two, you say, well, depends where you sit on the distribution. So think about a poverty alleviation program that groups like JPAL, they run a lot, Poverty Action Lab folks. So they published this paper in Science on showing how this kind of giving them an asset, a goat or things like that, got people out of poverty, and they stayed out of poverty for sort of I'm taking their examples because I'm working on some of those more recently. But they also showed a very nice table in that, which was the people who sat just below the poverty line obviously got a lot more out of that intervention than the one, because there's a depth to that poverty. So pulling someone from that, so giving the same goat to the one who's just below poverty line but happens to fall in your treatment group in terms of because they're poor, versus the one who are really sort of behind, maybe you needed something more. So that is a sort of, it could be that the same treatment needs to have a different dosage, or it could be completely different treatments, right? So at the time and point when you went, the group that's just hovering around the poverty line, because at some point we do have to define them, may not even need these assets, right? All it needed could have been something else. So that, to me, is sort of one thing. And in social interventions, let's say in the microcredit financing area, again, this comes up, right? If I give you something like money or whatever, it's normal. I've tested with my two kids. If I give them both $10, they go and do something very different from with those $10. Even though, one of mine, she would not spend it at all. She'll try to sort of get everything out of so clearly, you're going to anticipate that if that is random, to the extent that is just random, okay, it'll always stay. But somehow if some selection is happening post the treatment, then you would see these differences. So I think it's instead of putting that away, I think there's more, I would say, thought and inquiry needs to be done prior to sort of thinking about. And it gets back to this idea of really how do you define populations?
Hi. So I also enjoyed the talk very much. Along those same lines, so your talk made me think about tailored interventions and how we measure changes in groups that are at the extremes. So if you look back at the example that you just gave, the individual who is in low poverty versus the one that is very, very low in the same group. And then you might not be able to assess changes, particularly for that individual that's way on the tail. And this relates a lot to work I do in super obese populations and youth. Because the way that you measure changes for youth who are super obese is the percent that they are above the 120th percentile for height and weight based on the CDC growth charts. So I bring this up because I'm wondering if you think there could be a parallel for other conditions, in other words, in making tailored interventions for those groups that are really at the real end of the tail?
I would say yes. I think if repeated studies are showing this spread, post-treatment, and then I think it does make us go back to saying, are there multiple interventions? And they may vary a little bit, as I said, either in terms of the dosage or it's slightly a different intervention. It could be in the same family of whatever we are talking about as an anti-obesity prevention program. But, that can come in various sizes and forms. And how do we know which group is going to be most responsive for what type? And this goes back to the question of understanding the why before the what, right? So the why it works, I think it's equally important than whether it works or what works, right? Which seems to be the old RCT thing. But I don't think, if you do have two interventions that are really, works, and it works in a majority of the people, then you could say, okay, which one is going to be cost effective, right? If I do it in this population, it's going to cost me more, but the returns are high. I can very quickly do this. There will be equal benefit, etc. So to evaluate them on the sort of the comparative effectiveness would be one way to think it. But I'm digressing here. But I would definitely agree that there has to be a sort of targeted, but whether it's targeted in some unique sense, I don't know, or is it a flavor of something that you sort of mix and match? But clearly going beyond the kind of the very crude, broad way to thinking about it, it seems like it never seems to work. Right?
Well, thank you very much for the very stimulating talk. And while listening to your talk, I wonder what the issue or issues might be related to the interpretation of the technically random term in statistical models.
Yeah.
And roughly, very oversimplifying, there are some objective interpretation and subjective interpretation, and objective interpretation is that the world has random element, and that kind of is likely to lead to analyst mindset that okay, then we just ignore non-random element and focus on non-random. But subjective one is maybe this random aspects are not really random, most of them, but it's just because it looks random to the analyst, because we don't have enough information, and more fundamentally, we don't have enough understanding. And that mindset could lead to the continuous inquiry to individual differences, which are not understood yet. But how do you think about this?
Well, I think, no, thank you. I think you summarized this really well. I think, again, historically, if you think about it's both random/error, because the statistics were developed in a setting which were very highly controlled. So it had to be in Fisher's little fields. It was error. There was nothing else going on because he designed it on this whatever patches, and he was the one who was throwing the fertilizer. He was fully controlling it. So whatever was not there is fine. But when we actually encounter real data, or if we believe that is real data and not just measurement error collected with some, or data collected with a lot of measurement error, then the mindset has to change. So I mean, I like your part that I think, I actually ask this in my class all the time, a course that I teach on random effects modeling, where everybody when you show them the regression model, the random part is called error. It's not even called random, actually. It's one thing to call random, it's still okay. But actually it's called error, which is kind of really, it's a sort of way in which, and it's called error regardless of how the data was generated, which is, there's no way to know that's error. But what is very clear is the unexplained variation. Now, I think like on your second point, or the point that you said, so we could say, okay, this is the amount of variation that remains to still be understood. And there's a lot of it, right? I think there's a group out there in, I would say, health and medicine or biomedical research. One would fall in that group where they say we just haven't figured out at a minute detail of molecules in every individual, or just some way if I can just measure everything about you in terms of biology, all 9 yards, big data, I'll get to explaining, if not 100%, very large proportion. So that's definitely the group that's driving the precision medicine. There's a lot clearly riding on that, in this notion that if only we knew more, so let's find out more, we will get there. I think on the population side of the things, or epidemiological side of things, I think it's more of the Rose or the George. I can observe you day in, day out with a camera inside your body, what the molecules are doing, big data. I will still not be able to increase my R square that much. I think that it's more coming from ideology on one side. But I tend to say well, let's try. That's why it's called science, right? Because we don't know. If we knew, then it would be a fact, right? So in which case we don't have to go and study. So I think it couples with this kind of more disciplinary orientations that I don't think serves very much when you're focused on a problem like improving, reducing the burden of a particular disease. It's a problem rather than a discipline.
Thank you very much for absolutely fascinating talk. Lots to think about or argue about.
Looking forward to it. Thank you.